You might recognize this little character's face from one of the most famous film series in all of the history of American cinema. When he said, "Try not," "do or do not," he was speaking to his young apprentice who was trying to learn the ways of the mysterious religion called the Force. Of course, we're referring to the character of Yoda in the film series Star Wars, and specifically the second film, The Empire Strikes Back.
Of course, most people don't talk like Yoda. His speech pattern was unusual to make him more interesting and sound like a wise old Jedi master. But in reality, English word order is much less flexible. For example, you probably have recognized by now that most of the time English fronts or places its subject almost always at the beginning of the predicate, before the predicate idea, so that you have, again, a subject and predicate situation. Now, when the predicate's an action verb, as we've studied in previous videos, generally the predicate involves a verb, an action verb, which in this case we're going to focus on a transitive situation, followed by an object, and generally followed by an adverb or at least two. Of course, there are some restrictions. For example, generally you cannot separate the verb from the object, and specific adverbs do follow a specific order. For example, adverbs of place usually go before adverbs of time, and we'll look at that a little bit later in this video. But again, recognize that the order of these ideas are usually pretty fixed. A subject would come first, a verb would follow, with an object if necessary, and then of course an adverb idea. Where the predicate has a state of being verb, again the order is still usually pretty fixed. The state of being verb would come first, then followed by a noun complement or possibly an adjective complement. In this video series, we're going to look at some situations where the subject and verb relationship and other words in a sentence might follow a different order. So in this first group of ideas, we're going to look at some 6 basic situations where the subject and verb are actually going to be inverted or switched. Our first example refers to questions. In general, with questions, we notice there is an inverted word order between the subject and the auxiliary or helping verb. So, for example, notice in this situation, and we'll pull out our pen to demonstrate, that the subject would normally come before the verb. But in this case, the subject and the auxiliary verb seem to switch places. Now, in some situations you notice the word car is going with the word which, because you're asking about which car, but again the subject of the sentence is actually they. And once again you notice that they and did would switch places, and the main verb itself would follow afterwards. Again, same thing that when we have an expression such as how long. The verb has would switch with the subject Steve in this case, so that you would have, again, 2 ideas that would be switching locations. Of course, there are some exceptions. For example, questions where who or what is the subject of the question itself would use a normal word order. So for example, notice in this case, we don't actually have a subject. The word who would be the subject, because we don't know. So in this case, it would follow a normal word order. The subject would come first, the verb would follow. Who is knocking at the door? Or, what happened to you? Again, the subject would be what, and of course the verb happen would follow in right after it. Tag questions also involve an inverted word order, but in the tag question only. And remember, a tag question is when you add a question to the end of a sentence, especially if you're not sure as to the meaning of that sentence. So, for example, you are coming to the party, aren't you? Now, of course, another thing to recognize with tag questions is that generally, even though the verb itself is the same form, or the same verb, it actually would be in the negative form if the original idea were in the affirmative. And of course, again, the ideas would be that the helping verb and the subject would switch places. Another example of a situation where you have an inverted word order involves the word there. Now, the first thing we have to recognize is there, the word there, when it's used as the subject, actually has no meaning. It's what we would call an empty or perhaps dummy subject. In fact, the real subject can be found actually after the verb. So, for example, in this case, the subject is a reason, which would indicate that then the verb would have to be plural. Now, this is a common confusion for a lot of people, because we often think since there is in the subject place, there looks like a singular idea. But that's not always the case. For example, in this situation, notice we changed the verb to were, which is a plural form, because the word that follows is hundreds of demonstrators. So again, in this case, we have switched locations, because again, there is occupying the subject location. But again, technically, the word reason in our first example, and specifically a reason for everything, and then of course hundreds of demonstrators, these would serve as the actual subjects, or at least indicate what the subject would actually be. Now, it also has a similar idea to the word there. For example, when you have the pronoun as the subject, and especially when it involves a state of being or linking verb, the actual subject can often be found at the end. So, for example, this one's a little tricky. You start off with the word it, and as you follow along, you notice that the next idea is actually an adjective. However, as you keep reading, you recognize that there is an infinitive phrase that follows, to find a parking space. Now, the truth is, this is actually, in a way, complementing the adjective itself. In other words, it's explaining what do we mean by easy. See, if you just identified this part as the original sort of clause, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. It wasn't easy. Well, the question is, what wasn't easy? Again, the word it is a pronoun, which means it's referring to something else later in the sentence. Or in this case, it seems wrong to do it that way. Again, to do it that way would again be pointing to the actual subject of the sentence. Now, please note, as we said before, these are adjective complements. These words or phrases are actually complementing the adjective in the sentence. So in these situations, since these are state of being verbs, they don't have a noun complement here, they actually have an adjective complement. Now, if you're not sure, one thing you can do is by actually substituting the word it for the subject that you find at the end of the sentence. So you can kind of put it back in the right place, and then it becomes a little bit easier to see what the subject is and that it's actually an adjective complement, not a noun. So for example, if I moved to find a parking space in the position of it, now you notice that it becomes a little bit easier to recognize that this is actually the adjective complement of the sentence. Easy is now actually describing the process of finding a parking space. Same thing in our second example here. If I change it to a gerund form, it's kind of the same idea. By making it a gerund instead of an infinitive, finding a parking space, now you recognize that we've taken a gerund phrase and made it the subject. Again, easy would still be the adjective complement, modifying the process, that it was not easy. When you use an adverb of place expression in a sentence, especially when you have an intransitive action verb, watch what happens. So in a normal situation, if I had, for example, the tree stands in the front yard, again, stands in this case is intransitive because it doesn't require an object. Watch what happens when we take the adverb of place expression and put it in the subject location. Then you invert the order of the clause. In the front yard stands the tree. So in this case, now the subject is kind of towards the end and has switched places with the verb stands. Now note that this works best, in my opinion, with subjects that are inanimate. In other words, they're not living or they're non-human. So for example, plants, animals, monuments, and so on. And especially when you're using some of these following verbs. Verbs such as sit, or lie, or stand, or rise, or shine, or appear. Now again, we usually don't talk this way. This is something that's much more common that you would see in written expression. And of course, even then, we probably wouldn't use it as much today. So again, this is something that perhaps was a characteristic of an older form of English, when we used to be able to kind of more flexibly move words around in a sentence. The same thing kind of goes with negative words or expressions. So just like you saw with the place expressions, we can also put negative words in the location of the subject with an inversion, so to speak, of the subject and verb. And especially when you have auxiliary verbs, those helping verbs we've talked about before. So for example, in our normal sentence we have, she has never seemed upset. But now notice what happens when we place the word never at the beginning. Never has she seemed upset. Well, again, in this case, by moving the negative expression to the beginning, we have now asked the subject and helping verb especially to switch places. New parents seldom get 8 hours of sleep. Well, again, notice what happens when we move the negative expression to the beginning. In fact, now an auxiliary verb will appear. Seldom do new parents get 8 hours of sleep. So now another feature to keep in mind is that the word do would appear, since this is an action verb. He not only won, but he also set a new world record. Again, watch what happens. Not only did he win, so again, notice now we've taken the auxiliary verb to indicate the past tense, because the original word was in the past tense, and then we split it up. Not only did he win, but he also set a new world record. So again, we would move locations with the negative expression and then add an auxiliary verb to separate. So in a way, it kind of looks like a question, except of course it's not. So with conditional sentences, when a sentence has an adverb clause of condition, especially when the verb is were or should, or a form in the past perfect, such as had known, had written, had seen, etc., you can omit the word if and invert the subject and verb. So for example, if I were rich, I would travel. Well, again, notice what happens. We eliminate the word if and then switch the helping verb, or the verb, the state of being verb, and the subject here. If I had known her name, I would have introduced you to her. Well, again, watch what happens. Had I known her name, so again, the word if is now omitted, and then the had and I are switched. Now this particular construction is, again, more commonly used in writing. This is what we mentioned earlier, especially with place expressions. But it can also be used to add extra emphasis to the fact that these conditional ideas are most likely could not have occurred or are not going to occur. So again, you kind of emphasize sort of maybe a surprise element, or the fact that these aren't possible. So again, if you say, were I rich, that kind of sounds a little bit stronger to say, I'm not rich. So I would never have the ability to do this. So again, there is a particular purpose to it, but the truth is it's probably more commonly used in writing. Now there are some other ideas too that we have to think about when it comes to order. So first off, we talked about the order of adverbs. So as mentioned earlier, adverbs generally do follow a certain word order, especially when you have more than one adverb in a sentence. So for example, if you had an adverb of place, typically that adverb of place would come before the adverb of time. So in this example, we had drinks at the pub last night. Notice that last night, the adverb of time there would occur at the end. However, you do have some flexibility here. You could take the adverb of time and move it to the beginning. And sometimes you may or may not need a comma to separate it. Now this particular expression is fairly short, but sometimes you would use a comma here in this particular location, depending on how long the adverb would be. So now we have the sentence, last night we had drinks at the pub. Now speaking of adverbs, when we have adverb clauses and reduced adverb phrases, again, as we noticed in our previous videos, we talked about the fact that adverb clauses can go at the beginning or end of an independent clause. So for example, he will come to the party when he has time. So again, notice that adverb clause here is kind of following the subject, verb, or indirect object idea. When he has time, comma, he will come to the party. So again, now notice that the idea is introducing the sentence, but we have moved it to the beginning of the clause. Now, explained in the previous video, we talked about reduced adverb phrases, which means, again, taking the adverb clause and reducing it even more under certain situations. So, for example, instead of saying, I went to bed after I had finished my homework, you could say, I went to bed after finishing my homework. And then, of course, you could also move that idea to the beginning of the sentence. After finishing my homework, I went to bed. And remember, we have to make sure that the particular expression is correctly modifying who is doing the action. So again, in this case, we're talking about me doing this. Another tricky situation involves direct and indirect objects. When we have more than two objects with the transitive action verb and the predicate, one of these objects is called the direct object, and that's the thing or person that's directly receiving the action from the verb. And this is what we generally find after the verb. However, the other object, if there happens to be more than one, is called the indirect object, and this is to whom or what, or for whom or what, the action verb is being done. So, generally, when you have these two objects present, generally the indirect object would come first. So notice in this example, a salesperson sold me a new TV. So in this case, the indirect object, me, would usually come before the direct object. Now, of course, this is not always true. So we're talking about in general. We especially have to keep in mind what happens when we have indirect objects, whether they use a preposition or not. So, for example, there are some verbs that can use prepositions, or rather indirect objects that can use prepositions. Now, this is not a complete list. Certainly there are longer lists of ideas. But for example, those verbs that have to use the word to, as you see here on the left side, and those verbs that use the word for when using indirect objects, we have to think about how they can be written. So again, in my example, I bought a new TV for my mom. You could just as easily move my mom to before the object itself, so that now the indirect object could come first. Now again, this is kind of strictly a matter of choice. So the indirect object, my mom, now is in the location that you would normally find the direct object. The same is true here. Sylvia is writing a letter to her sister. Again, you could easily switch. Of course, you would also remove the preposition. Now you could say that Sylvia is writing her sister a letter. Now again, this is not possible with every verb. Only those particular verbs that indicate whether or not they need to use this preposition. So there are special situations. So these particular verbs you see here don't necessarily have to use the prepositions. It's kind of merely a matter of choice, which one sounds better to you. Most English speakers, especially Americans, would probably use the second example. And that's usually because we're much more comfortable putting the indirect object before the direct object. And that's usually just because of practice, since that's usually the case in English. These particular situations of indirect objects would need a preposition. So with these particular verbs, you must use an indirect object with a preposition. Or rather, you must use a preposition with them. So for example, again, the words on the left side using the word to, and the words on the right side using the word for. So for example, the poet explained the poem to us. You could not move to us or us to the position directly after the verb. You could not say the poet explained us the poem. That doesn't make sense. So in this case, it's better to keep the indirect object to us here at the end of the sentence. So in this case, this is a situation that would be an exception. The direct object would come first, and the indirect object would come next. She also described the process of writing poetry to us. Again, us, as the indirect object, since it's to us, could not go to the position after the verb. You could not say she also described us. You would have to continue to use to us, and in this case you would keep it at the end of the sentence. So the direct object, the process of writing poetry, would come first, and to us, the indirect object, would follow. Same thing here. In terms of the word change, could you please change the $20 for me? Again, you couldn't use the word me after the word change. In fact, that would make the situation very strange. To change me? Could you change me? That sounds like you're trying to become a different type of person. Well, again, that's because the word change here is talking about making change for a $20 bill. So in this case, you couldn't move the words for me. They would have to stay after the direct object. So again, in this particular situation, when you use verbs that need prepositions, in this case, the objects would have to stay, the indirect objects would have to stay at the end. Now, noun clauses, as we discussed in previous videos, often can be used as the subject or an object in a sentence. So as we said before, notice the order of ideas when we use them in these particular locations. Now, this is from a previous video. So we're going to look at a couple of special situations in the next slide in just a moment. But notice when we use the connector whether, or when we use question words, notice what happens to the order of the situation. So, for example, if you notice here, even though these look like they came from questions, they follow a normal word order. When we use the word whether, of course, there are some few things we have to pay attention to. So, when we have those particular noun clauses that use those question words, there is a difference. They do follow normal word order. Whereas the question might say, where is she? And again, we would have that switch between the subject and verb. If I were to respond using a noun clause, for example, if I used one as the object of the sentence, notice now the subject and verb would change. Where is she? The response, I don't know where she is. So notice you would not say, I don't know where is she. That would actually sound like a question. And this is actually a fairly tricky thing for students to remember, because in the question we switch them, but in this particular case, in the response, we wouldn't. That's because as the object of the sentence, the order would become a normal word order. And as we mentioned before, when using that connector whether or not, you could potentially split the expression. She doesn't know whether he finished his homework or not. Now, that would kind of sound like a more formal situation. You might also notice in more informal situations, somebody might put the or not back at the beginning. She doesn't know whether or not he finished his homework. So again, these are a couple of other situations where word order, we kind of have to remember how they function. Now, with coordinating situations, we talked about the fact that compound sentences often are created using those coordinating connectors. One of those connectors, the word nor, does have a few special rules to remember, and this is actually somewhat connected to the negative expressions we talked about a little bit earlier in this video. So, for example, notice when you're trying to make two parts of the sentence kind of reflect the fact that both of these things did not happen, we could use the word nor to help link these ideas. So notice what happens. So, my parents did not teach me how to swim, nor, so again, notice this is consistent now. It's reinforcing the negativity of the first part by saying, nor did I learn at school. Now, again, this seems a little unusual. First off, the auxiliary verb would switch locations with the subject. Second, it would appear that you would say, I didn't learn at school. Why would we move that particular idea? Well, that's because the not is being replaced. So instead of saying, my parents didn't teach me how to swim, nor I didn't learn at school, the not is actually being replaced in the second part by the word nor. I haven't visited my parents for 2 years, nor have they visited me. So again, instead of making the second part negative like you would in a normal situation, nor would take the place of that, and then cause there to be a switch between the subject and verb, and in this case the helping verb. So again, the auxiliary or helping verb switches places with the subject. Now, of course, as we said before, the word nor, we don't need another negative adverb, so nor will actually help take the place of it, which now becomes no longer necessary. So again, this is one of those little things we just have to remember. Yes, is it a little formal? Most of us probably don't use the word nor in our everyday conversation. So again, this is one of those situations that might be more common in writing than we see in speaking. Mainly because we usually don't use the word nor in speaking. An area where students are often confused involves the difference between passive and active voice. For example, a sentence written in an active voice generally has a subject that can actually do a particular action. So, for example, William Shakespeare wrote Hamlet around 1600. But now, what if I wanted to focus on the word Hamlet? What if the article that this is from is talking about the play instead of necessarily William Shakespeare? So in this case, you would create a passive voice sentence, in which now Hamlet appears to be the subject, but then you would construct it using this particular form of the verb, was written. Then, by William Shakespeare will become what we call the passive agent. In other words, this would normally be the subject of the sentence, but since Hamlet is the focus of the sentence, it would probably not make sense, of course, to put William Shakespeare there. Again, if we're talking more about Hamlet than in William Shakespeare, it would make more sense to continue to use Hamlet in the subject field. Now, William Shakespeare, who would normally be the subject in an active voice sentence, is what we would be called now the passive agent. And again, the key word here is to look for, and sometimes we see in the sentence the word by. Now, of course, we don't always see that. It really depends on what the author is trying to say. So as we said before, active voice refers to when the person or thing doing the action is a logical agent. Now, we can demonstrate this, of course, by using something that's not logical. The play Hamlet wrote around 1600. You see, it doesn't quite make sense. The play Hamlet can't write. It's a play. It's a piece of paper. It's a document. And of course, nor can it write itself. So certainly somebody had to write it. So as you can see, this sentence would have to be changed into the passive voice, or you would have to put a different person in the place to say who wrote Hamlet. So again, the passive voice is when the clause is organized to emphasize what would normally be the object of a verb. So the construction, as we mentioned before, would start off with that to be verb, or the passive voice would involve the supposed subject, the to be verb, plus a past participle, and then followed by sometimes the word by, and of course the passive agent. So again, as we said here, Hamlet, the play. So again, Hamlet is referring to the play, was written by William Shakespeare. So again, Hamlet looks to be the subject, so this would be considered kind of the passive subject. But clearly we know William Shakespeare is the one who wrote it. So, the situations explained in this video, in my opinion, reflect the fact that English, perhaps, or definitely used to be So the situations explained in this video reflect the fact that English used to be a much more flexible language with regards to word order. Yet what happened over time is that language became more rigid and fixed. So, for example, it used to be much more common to switch the subject and verb, but now, over time, thanks to the evolution of the language, English had a much more fixed word order. So, in one way, that explains why many of these examples are much more commonly used in written form. Again, written forms tend to be a little more conservative, so they tend to keep a little bit more of the history of a language. And of course, they also tend to be more formal in register. So, for example, we tend to use the active voice more when we speak than we do the passive voice. And the passive voice seems something that's much more common to academic writing. Now, this isn't true, of course. As we demonstrated, questions, well, we use questions all the time, speaking or in writing. But the key, of course, in studying this video is just to learn these particular exceptions. I wish that there were an easy explanation or a simple kind of trick or formula that you can memorize, but the truth is, you really just have to sit down and learn them. And keep in mind, yes, they're probably much more formal, they're probably used much more in a written form, but if you ever have any chances or hopes to study more academic reading or academic language, you might run across these particular situations. In our next video, we will look at some other common confusing situations in English, including understanding the concept of parallelism, talking about collective nouns, and of course just looking at other general peculiarities of the English language. Thanks for watching.